Okay, welcome to the August 2021 Plant Lovers Tour. Some like it hot. I don't like it hot. You're inside in the air conditioning. I'm guessing you don't like it hot. To me, my ideal temperature range is 70s. But there are plants that don't mind this weather, that add a lot of color and interest to the garden through the worst of summer. We are in the planting at the Arboretum known as the bulb border or the geophyte border. And so they are all things that grow from storage units under the ground. And I'm standing next to a ginger lily, a hedychium. They are the same family as the culinary ginger. But the true gingers, the zingiber's, make small flowers right at ground level, so they're not very showy in bloom, but the hedychiums have these big terminal inflorescences of flowers. The earliest ones start blooming about midsummer and often will continue up until the weather turns cool in the fall. These flowers aren't in great shape. If I can get Chris to agree, we'll take a few steps in a little while and look at some that are absolutely glorious. But this is a selection of Hedychium coccineum, coccineum meaning scarlet. I never think of these as being scarlet, but more sort of a pastel orange. And this particular selection is Disney. But they're rather large growing plants, much like cannas, but not bothered by any of the canna leaf rollers that can be such a problem on cannas. Let's see, just sort of going plant by plant as we go through this border. You don't expect members of the African violet family to be winter hardy because the family is largely tropical. But there are species of Syningia that are winter hardy. Syningia is the genus of the big florist gloxinia, which if you're a real young person, you might never have seen the big florist gloxinias for sale. It's been years since I've seen them for sale, but very different in habit are these Syningias, and this is a hybrid called Bananas Foster. They make a big tuber underground, and one thing I should say about a lot of these bulbs that are at their best this time of year is that some of them are from warmer climates, but because we can get cold in the winter, but generally our cold spells are brief and frost doesn't penetrate the soil to any significant depth, that these things that might not survive a zone 7 winter in an area where the cold spells last for many weeks, these things survive because the tuber or the bulb is underground where it's protected. The Syningias are completely disappear in the winter. I know when we did this tour for a live audience yesterday, it seemed almost all the things I pointed out yesterday were things that have been in bloom since May and will continue up to frost. And that's true of these hybrid Syningias. We'll see a few more as we go through the border, but we'll continue to look at things as we walk through the border. The pineapple lilies, you can see where they get their common name of pineapple lily. The inflorescence is sort of structured like a pineapple. It has the little ruff of leaves up at the top of the flower stalk. The pineapple lilies are in the genus Eucomis. This one is Eucomis comosus. There's a few other species. And this one is actually no longer in bloom. They're in bloom for a few weeks, but then the fruit, you can see the fruit developing in the center of the sepals. I didn't mean to break the whole top of that off, but they remain showy for probably months, and it's one of the longest lasting cut flowers. Most plants can't be propagated from leaf cuttings, but the pineapple lilies are exception. If you've ever rooted the common houseplant, snake plant, Sansevieria, from leaf cuttings, it's done in exactly the same manner. I'll just steal a leaf here. The one thing that's critical or crucial when you take a leaf cutting of a pineapple lily or any plant is that you maintain the normal polarity. This is the bottom of the leaf, the part closest to the bulb, and this is the top of the leaf. If you stick it in with that proper orientation, they should root and make a few little plantlets at the bottom of the piece of leaf. But if you planted it upside down, it won't work. But you don't need the whole leaf blade. You could cut this one into about 4 pieces. Now, this one's a little small, but you know, we had 3, I guess these are 3 or 4 inches long, 3 nice cuttings and all stuck in, you know, maybe about 1/4 or 1/2 inch down into a good quality potting soil, and just kept not soggy, just evenly moist and in the shade. And a couple months from now, you'll start to see a little leaf coming up from the bottom of the original leaf. But it's a fun way to propagate them. All right. This time of year, there's always naked ladies in the garden. If you've gardened in the South for a long time, you know that what I'm talking about. These Lycoris. This is Lycoris squamigera. It's a small genus, all native to Asia. Many of the so-called species collected in the wild are thought to be natural hybrids. Natural because they weren't man-made. They were, you know, the hybridization was done by the pollinators, the bees or whatever visited the flower. And so the ones that are hybrids generally don't set seed, but some of the true species are quite fertile. They're in the Amaryllis family. They grow from a big bulb, much like a daffodil bulb. And some of the Lycoris have 2 different growth habits. Some species, they all bloom late summer. I guess maybe in a milder part of the world, it might be fall by the time they bloom. But some of them, like Lycoris squamigera, will not put up their foliage until the spring. And because of that, they can be grown in much colder climates than here because the foliage doesn't get destroyed by winter's cold. And well, I need to take a few steps down this way. I like to make sure our cameraman gets enough exercise. This is also a Lycoris. This is Lycoris rosea, considered to be a interspecific hybrid. And it will put up its foliage, in the next month or so and have that foliage all winter long. And in zone 7, the foliage usually fares just fine. But in a colder climate, the foliage can get hurt, like in zone 6 and colder. So in those climates, the bulbs usually don't persist because they're weakened by losing their foliage each winter. They're generally propagated just by dividing the bulbs, not the individual bulbs, but a clump of bulbs. They multiply fairly steadily, and so in time, you know, where you had just a bulb or a few, there's now many. I'm going to take a step backwards and jump back to the topic of the Syningias. This is another hybrid, Syningia Arkansas Bells, lovely pink one. These hybrid ones are sterile. They do not make seed, but they're super easy from stem cuttings. Okay. Oh, and I'll step back here. Red is a common color in the these Syningia hybrids because one of its most important parents, Syningia salviana, has a coral red flower. Oh, I think this one is Scarlet O'Hara, but I don't find the label just now. But there's a number of real similar red flowered hybrid Syningias. And as you might guess, with a tubular flower, the hummingbirds do visit the flowers. Oh, here's something I saw yesterday, but then got distracted and I forgot to point it out to anybody. First of all, we're looking at the foliage of another ginger lily that hasn't yet started blooming, but it's a variegated one named Dr. Moy. There's a sport of Dr. Moy called Vanilla Frost that has, probably 3 times as much white striping in the leaf and sort of apricot orange flowers. But climbing through this is this climbing bulb. Now, we don't usually use those 2 terms in one sentence to describe one plant, a climbing bulb. This is such a beautiful thing that the person who named the genus chose the name Gloriosa for the generic name. This is Gloriosa, the Gloriosa lily, and it grows from a finger-like tuber, maybe not quite a true bulb underground, and it's fully winter hardy here and blooms for an extended period of time. But these really beautiful flowers, and you can see plants that climb have different methods of climbing, and here the tip of the leaf becomes a tendril, so it'll clamber through neighboring shrubs and such. A real beauty, real easy, not planted enough, but certainly worthwhile. And dahlias. Dahlias been blooming for months. These single ones are highly favored by pollinators. You can see there's a bunch of bumblebees around me. Most of these are unnamed seedlings. The single ones produce a large number of seeds, and so we get lots of seedlings. This one might be a named one that looks a little bit like Bishop of Llandaff, who's parent of many of the dark-flowered seedlings. Sometimes, if they're shabby looking at this time of the year, we will cut them to the ground, and I do mean to the ground, and then they'll put up all new growth and be fresh and be especially nice in late fall or mid-fall before we have a frost. They're always at their best in the fall, though they're entirely worth growing all summer long. Dahlias generally are winter hardy here in Zone 7, so you don't have to lift them every fall like you do in a colder climate. Yet another Syningia cultivar looking very much like Arkansas bells, but a shorter statured plant. This is one whose cultivar name is Lovely. I'm not describing the cultivar name, that is the cultivar name. When we get to the perennial border, we'll see these lilies in bloom. It's Lilium formosanum, the Formosa lily. Well, when we get to the border, you see that it's a big Easter lily-like flower. It's a lily that's almost weedy, if you can imagine that. You see them scattered here and there, and that's because they come up real readily from seed on their own. And it's a lily that if you sowed the seed, what did you say, Chris, in January? Yeah. If you sow the seed in January, they'll bloom that same year. Whereas it might be true of not just some of our native species, but I know some of our native species, you have to sow the seeds. It has to go through a winter in order to break dormancy. But after it breaks dormancy, the only thing it does that growing season is make a root, I guess the initial bulb, and then it has to go through that summer and another winter, and then it'll germinate and make a shoot. And even then, it's really slow from seed. So the Lilium formosanum has a very different life habit, so it'll live fast. And we leave it standing in the winter because the seed pods are gorgeous. It's like this candelabra of buff-colored candles. And they're 3-chambered pods, about 4, maybe almost 5 inches tall, and stacked with paper-thin seeds that probably are dispersed each time there's a little breeze, but very worthwhile. And we'll see you in a few minutes. All right. Let's see what we find further on. A smaller statured Eucomis. This one still in bloom. You can see there's a few creatures visiting the flowers. It's labeled Eucomis montana. I'm not familiar with that species, but there's some even smaller ones that are only about 6 inches tall. This is the wild parent of all of those, well, one of the wild parents of all those Syningia hybrids we saw earlier. This is Syningia salviana. It is very fertile, and like most flowering plants, if it's set a lot of seed, it's less inclined to continue blooming. So we do deadhead this if we have a spare moment. You know, this inflorescence has one, well, the flower just decided to go away, so we just cut the whole flower, what was the flower stalk off that is now just seed. I trimmed a bunch yesterday for the tour, so there's not too much to cut off. But if you do that, it's more likely to repeat blooming. This spot has gotten shadier as this crepe myrtle has gotten bigger, but so it goes. Syningia salviana, S-E-L, nope. Maybe 2 L's.
Yeah, I'm not finding that one in the records for some reason.
Maybe it's Sallovii. Maybe it's Sallovii.
S-E-L-L-O-V-I-I.
Yeah, something like that. There are many hydrangeas we grow in the garden, and most of them are more spring flowering, but Hydrangea paniculata is certainly more a plant of summer. Hydrangea paniculata is named for the panicle hydrangea. Panicle is a type of inflorescence. It's a branched inflorescence. And some hydrangeas bloom on old wood and some bloom on new wood. Old wood is sort of a confusing term because it's not old, you know, like your great-great-grandfather is old. It just merely means the flower buds are produced the year before. So like on this Hydrangea macrophylla, if we were to cut these tips off, we'd be cutting off next year's flower buds because the flower buds are formed in the summer and the fall, and they are what's going to open next spring. You know, this time of year, it's August, but I know if you went around and looked at your camellias and dogwoods and such, you would already see next year's flower buds. So it's important to know that when you're pruning. Of course, if you're just cutting out old wood, it wouldn't matter too much. But because Hydrangea paniculata blooms on new wood, you can cut it back really hard in the spring and it's still going to bloom. We did cut this one, I like to say, to the ground, but it was more like down to about 6 inches or so. Maybe you can see the stumps. So all of these stems were produced this year. We cut it back hard, partly because it was getting too big for this location. It's, you know, about 6 foot tall. When you cut it back hard, the flower heads are especially large. But limelight is good about standing up, which is a nice feature. Years ago, the only Hydrangea paniculata cultivar that was available was one that was commonly known as the PG hydrangea, both spelled with a double E, P-E-E-G-E-E. And the P was for paniculata, as in Hydrangea paniculata, and G for grandiflora. And it had a big head like that, but it did not ever support itself, so it ended up looking like this with the flower heads, you know, dragging in the mud on the ground. So plant breeders have bred, when they're doing really good work, they breed for plants that manage to stand up. Now, I have encountered some new cultivars of Hydrangea paniculata that aren't really good at standing up, so that's the kind I would send to the compost pile. And the other thing about Hydrangea paniculata in so many plants nowadays, if you want one that only gets 3 foot tall, then don't buy one that you're going to have to cut back to keep the 3 feet tall. Buy one that matures at 3 feet tall. Hydrangea, the full-size Hydrangea paniculatas, you know, they can get 10, 12 feet tall, but there are very compact selections. There's a more compact selection of limelight called Little Lime that probably matures at about 5 foot without any pruning. Hydrangea paniculata is also a sun lover. It doesn't have to have sun all day like it does here, but it'll thrive the more sun you give it. Whereas all the other hydrangeas that are common in gardens are happier to be out of the hot sun. This might be the smallest growing of the Hydrangea paniculata cultivars. It's actually a seedling grown from Daruma, and Daruma is a Japanese term, and I have to think it must mean dwarf or something along that line, because every time I see Daruma, it's a smaller growing selection of the plant. This one has never been pruned to maintain its height, and you know, it's not even 3 feet tall. It's probably closer to like 30 inches tall at the most. Now, it's not a showstopper, but it does make the point that if you want Hydrangea paniculata, but you need it to stay small, then choose one of the smaller growing selections. And this also gives me the opportunity we saw limelight. Well, let me go back one step. In hydrangeas, you have 2 types of flowers. These great big ones are sterile florets. And then the fertile flowers, this is no longer in bloom, so instead of flowers, we have the little fruit. But the fertile flowers are these tiny flowers in the center. And in the wild, you never see plants with flower heads like that limelight. They're all this type, where it's mostly small flowers and just you know, a limited number of the sterile flowers. And if you grow Hydrangea macrophylla, you know the 2 terms, mophead and lacecap. This would be considered a lacecap, where it's mostly fertile flowers and small number of sterile flowers, whereas something like your typical big blue hydrangea or the limelight would be the mop-headed one. And, you know, I guess you could argue that the ones with more sterile florets are showier. But if you want to plant things that support pollinators, then these ones with a large number of fertile flowers are really good for supporting pollinators. Whether it's, you know, an Asian species like paniculata or our native oak leaf hydrangea or Hydrangea arborescens. I can't think of a common name for Hydrangea arborescens. Plants with the common name of angel trumpets fit into 2 genera. This one here, looking quite a bit like a large eggplant plant, is a datura. The other genus is Brugmannsia, named after somebody with the good German family name of Brugmann. And there many, well, this Datura inoxi is winter hardy here, but also if it wasn't, we'd still have it in the garden because it comes back very freely from seed. And seeds, you know, germinated in the garden on their own in the spring will be blooming by this time of the year. The Brugmannsias vary in their cold hardiness, but many of them are winter hardy. And come back, and there's one in bloom today in the garden. Now the Datoras and the Brugmansias differ in that the Datoras have upright facing flowers, and the Brugmansias are more shrub-like, tall growing, and they have pendant flowers. So having said that, they're pendant by day, and then in the evening when they open up, they're more at an angle, but not upward. Now, this angel's trumpet flower at this stage is going to open tonight. And I mention that because if you're invited to dinner, you can pick a whole bunch of these and take them and put them in a jar on the dining room table or the picnic table and watch them open about 7, 8 o'clock at night. And this is the great big white flower that Georgia O'Keeffe painted in one of her famous paintings. Easy and fun. They're in the nightshade family. And Datura is the same genus as Jimson weed. So the nightshade family has important food crops like tomatoes, peppers, eggplant. What is the fourth one I'm forgetting? Potatoes, and tobacco. But it's also a family of many poisonous plants. So don't be chomping on members of that family unless you know better. I'm calling it the nightshade family, but it's probably more accurately referred to as the deadly nightshade family. Another plant in that nightshade family is the cestrum. And cestrum is spelled with a C, C-E-S-T-R-U-M. And darn, Chris, I should have looked it up. I never remember whether this is lemon peel or orange peel.
We agreed it was lime appeal. Lemon peel.
I love it, lime appeal. But it is a shrub. If we had a cold winter, like a cold zone 7 winter, it'll die to the ground. And despite that, it'll still be almost this size and in full bloom by May. And it will bloom up until frost. Pollinators like it. I see a big carpenter bee on it, but the hummingbirds will also visit the flowers. Now, it is like most plants where the ones that are real showstoppers, like lilies and iris and peonies with big gaudy flowers, they're only in bloom for a few weeks at the most. And most of the things that bloom for months and months have small flowers. And so what they make up for not being a showstopper with their length of bloom. And they're really, the showstoppers, the lilies and irises and such, are sort of like the diva that's on the stage for 5 minutes and then walks off the stage. But this is the supporting cast that's there for the whole length of the performance. So really worthwhile, easy from cuttings. We ended up with the seedlings, and now that we have 2 individuals, they're setting a lot of fruit. So we're actually going to eliminate one of them so they produce fewer seedlings.
It's orange peel, Doug.
Orange peel. Well, maybe that's why I'm always confused, because it's closer to yellow than orange.
Yes.
Okay.
Or yellow.
Yeah. And I'm going to step back here and just cut a stem. This is a shrub native to the southwest U.S. and I imagine extending into Mexico as well. It's an aloysia, closely related to lemon verbena, and it's common. I just remember this specific epithet. It's Aloysia gratissima. It has a really nice fragrance. I know the better known, well, what's the big almond scented one? Aloysia is fragrant all day long, but gets real fragrant in the evening, and you'll smell it on the air, which is a really nice feature. But this one has the common name of like bee plant or something. It's a really good plant for pollinators. Not a showstopper, but these are young plants. I think it was planted last year, or no, it was 2 years ago that the bee hotel was built. And it was at that point that we started planting ornamental plants that are especially good for pollinators around the bee hotel. Every gardener, says you should have seen the garden last week or seen this plant last week. Well, this is one of two plants I'm most excited about this year. This is buttonbush, Cephalanthus. It's Cephalanthus occidentalis. Now, buttonbush is a North American native, and the common form that occurs in the Midwest and the East Coast is a plant that it would be miserable in this hot, dry spot, but given moisture, our local form of buttonbush is quite a nice thing, but it also only blooms for about a month in the spring. This is supposedly the same species, but a southwest form of it. Still Cephalanthus occidentalis. Occidentalis referring to western because it's a small genus, but there are species or two in Asia. And this spot is hot and dry because it faces south and is in sun almost the entire day. And most of the arboretum doesn't get any irrigation at all. But it was in bloom in May, and it keeps on putting up new shoots. These are inflorescences that haven't yet bloomed. You can see it bloomed here, and then as it was done blooming, it's putting up these side shoots. So it's probably going to continue blooming, all summer up until, I might guess, up to frost, and just keeps on going. And it's a great pollinator plant, as is the local form, but just keeps on going. And it's proven to be very easy to root from cuttings. So we potted up some rooted cuttings yesterday or the day before. So Cephalanthus, Ceph referring to head, anthus, flower, probably because the round head of flowers, and occidentalis. Mark brought it back from the southwest, or from a garden who had gotten it from the southwest, and he said, this is a special plant. And I like our native form of buttonbush, but I thought, all right, special plant. And first summer didn't impress, but this spring it just wowed me, and I'm really impressed that it's continuing to put up new growth all the time. Yesterday, early afternoon, it was cool and cloudy, and this plant was not being visited by many pollinators at all, and now it's just totally in motion with skippers and butterflies and bumblebees. Skippers are the skippers I'm seeing here are these little orange and black ones, which are, the third group of Lepidopteras. So you have butterflies and moths, and then you have skippers who hold their wings upright when they're stationary. I see one of my favorite butterflies, the buckeye, down front with the big eye spots on the wing. But this is a plant that a lot of people see and think it's a verbena. Perfectly reasonable to think that, but this is heliotrope. It's not the old-fashioned heliotrope that was grown for its fabulous fragrance, but isn't a winter-hardy plant. This is a hardy perennial, and this is Heliotropium amplexicoli. Amplexicoli meaning clasping the stem. I hate to cut a single flower off and force a poor pollinator to go without a meal. But the leaves do clasp the stem, not in a really profound way, but it has an interesting inflorescence. At least this part of it, I don't know how well you can see, but the whole inflorescence is a cyme. But this is a specific type of cyme. Cyme is C-Y-M-E. It's a scarpoid cyme. And scarpoid referring to scorpions, because if you notice the tip of the inflorescence is curled over like the tail of a scorpion over its back. And when you see that, you know you're looking at this heliotrope and not verbena. Now, I've seen it naturalized along roadsides and further south, like South Carolina and Georgia on the coastal plain. And it's not a U.S. native, it's native to South America. In gardens, it produced some seedlings, but it's, you know, it's easy enough to dispatch the young seedlings, and it'll bloom from May up until frost. And anything that feeds this number of pollinators, I would put up with. And I'm quite sure this is all one really big plant. They die completely to the ground, but, you know, I think it's all growing from one root underground. And I've seen it bloom through, you know, summers with far longer dry spells than what we've had this summer. So a plant that I wouldn't want to be without. This is a fun plant. And I don't know, maybe somebody will be throwing tomatoes at their computer screen saying, you're talking about an annual. I'm sorry. But this is actually a species of Lantana. It's Lantana trifolia. On a typical stem, and maybe this one's not going to cooperate, it's not cooperating. Usually everything is, well, here we go. Everything's in a whorl of three. You see 3 leaves, and then from each leaf node you have a stalk of flowers. And I guess in a milder climate it would be winter hardy. Here it comes back from seed every year. And then I think this might be the neatest thing about the plant. The fruit is bright, sort of fuchsia purple, or maybe magenta. So the fruit itself is an ornamental aspect of the plant. And these are a little undersized. Probably if we had a little bit more moisture, there'd be another 6 inches tall. And so all the ones you see in the perennial border are, you know, just coming back from seed each year. Lantana trifolia. And you think, that looks just like Calicarpa fruit. Well, it's not terribly surprising. They're in the same family. I was a little bit surprised to learn that Calicarpa is close relative of verbena. So verbena trifolia. I don't have a super good specimen of Crinum to show you today, but the Crinums or Crinum lilies, the scientific name for the genus is Crinum, or a lot of people pronounce it Crinum. Another member of the Amaryllis family, this large volume of strap-like foliage. And this particular individual one is Cecil Howdyshell. Mr. Howdyshell was a California nurseryman in the early half of the previous century, or maybe the mid part of the 20th century. And it's not the showiest one, but the thing of note is that this one will bloom for months and months. There are many other crinums with showier flowers that are in bloom for a few weeks, but this will go on for most of the summer. It's taking a little break right now, but we do have this inflorescence down here that probably bumped into something on its way upward. And so I can cut it because it's never gonna, I didn't manage to cut it. There we go. Oh, I cut the wrong end of it. But it probably bumped into crinums have glass ceilings too, and it probably bumped into it and never got up above the foliage, but you can see the stem had sort of coiled around. But that's a fresh inflorescence. And many of the crinums are very fragrant. I don't know that Cecil is, and many of them are most fragrant in the evening, not during the day. And the ones that tend to be fragrant in the evening, the flowers will be sort of a little bit droopy by the heat of the day, but then come evening, they stand back up, and instead of being like that, they stand up really proud and are at their prettiest in the early evening. Most crinums want sun. There's a species or two that prefer shade, like Crinum morii, but most are sun lovers. And, you know, you need to be patient with a crinum. And patience is repaid by the fact that the longer they're established, the more flowers they will have. But my experience was that they will also repeat bloom more often the longer they're established. Now, there's some varieties like White Queen, which is a Luther Burbank introduction, so it's been around quite a long time, and it's one of the prettiest crinums, but it only blooms once, but it's about the first one, maybe blooming as early as April. But give them room. There's a lot of breeding work going on with crinums, a lot of very exciting breeding work. There's some people breeding smaller ones, which I think could be useful. There's some breeding works to make what I always thought of as already a large plant into larger plants. I don't know if I'd have room for something larger than this, but a lot of old, long-tested cultivars, but a lot of new ones to try as well. We saw Lilium formosanum in the bulb border, not yet open. Well, here it is, fully open. You know, this is an average size one, probably not quite 5 feet tall, but you see back there is one that's probably 7 foot tall, and that's pretty typical if they have good growing conditions. It's been fairly dry this summer, so they're probably smaller for that reason. They're very fragrant. Some strains have a burgundy outside to the outer tepals, and I'm using the term tepal, T-E-P-A-L. It's a term botanists use when the 3 outer sepals and the 3 inner petals are all petal-like, so tepals. And they are Lilium formosanum. I haven't looked up the derivation because formosanum can refer to something from Formosa, which is an old name for Taiwan. But Formosa, if you go back further, Formosa actually means beautiful. So someone named Taiwan beautiful. And so a lot of things that are named Formosa, it is because the person naming them thought they were beautiful. Oh, an old-fashioned plant blooming here, a little shabby during the heat of the day, is this soapwort, or soapwort. W-O-R-T is an old English word for plant. A lot of definitions of words change over time. And it is called soapwort because even nowadays my understanding is that the plant is used to make a very gentle lather that is used for washing, you know, precious museum textiles. But this is, the genus is Saponaria, also referring to soap. Like saponify is to make soap. And this is Saponaria officinalis. Officinalis always referring to something that has had use in the apothecary shop. And this is the double form of it, Rosa plena. I would avoid the single form because the single form makes lots of seedlings. The double form does not. Often when a flower goes from a single to a double form, it's the reproductive parts that become the additional petals, so they no longer can produce seed. It's no longer, that's not always the case, but probably most of the time. It has a delightful fragrance. Here, I'll hold it up close so you can sniff. It's really a nice fragrance, and it just blooms for months. It's a real old-fashioned thing that you might have trouble finding in the nursery trade nowadays, but worth growing. There's also a double white, which is quite lovely. It's a pure white. Oh, they're not open today. I could make one of them open. Yeah, let me cut a stem because it's of note. Yesterday, when we first gave this tour, it seemed like half the plants we talked about were members of the Hibiscus family, also known as the mallow family. And this is a plant known as golden hibiscus. And I don't know if they're typically closed this time of day. Let me put that thing down. But the mallow family is characterized by 5 petals. I don't know if there's exceptions. It's a I'm mangling this poor flower, but think of a big hibiscus bloom in this lovely pale yellow. And then the hibiscus flower, the male and female parts are fused together. So you have the stigma up at the top, which is the part of the female parts of the flower that accept the pollen. And then fused to the stem of the stigma are the multiple anthers with stamens. I'm confused. Well, with the male part of the flower that produces the pollen, you might be able to see the little yellow. When we find another hibiscus, we'll probably have a better example. But if anyone in the audience is looking at this plant, you might say, well, that looks a lot like okra. Well, it is in the hibiscus or mallow family, but there's many genera in that family, and this is in the same genus as okra. Okra they're both in the genus Abelmoschus, moschus referring to musk, and okra is Abelmoschus esculenta, which means esculenta meaning edible and delicious, and that is, 3,000% accurate. Okra is one of the glories of summer. I hear people retching in the audience. But you see the fruit are very much like okra fruit, but very much, much more bristly. It's unpleasant to hold this stem, but I'll suffer for you. And it is winter hardy here. Plants will overwinter, but even in areas where it's not winter hardy, it's worth growing from seed because you could sprinkle the seed in the garden in April and they'd be in full bloom now. They bloom for quite a while, and this flower stalk just has a few more buds. The rest are all fruit. And in order to keep it in bloom longer, when it gets to this point, we'll either cut this stalk off and leave the rest of the plant, but we've also more recently taken to just cutting the whole plant to the ground. And in early August, they'll have time to regrow and rebloom again. So really worthwhile. And behind it is another member of that family. This is a rose of Sharon, Hibiscus syriacus. Syriacus referring to Syria. Some European got the wrong information and thought Rose of Sharon was from the Middle East, so they thought, well, let's name it Syriaca, but it's an Asian species, and it is the national flower of Korea. Most people who have gardened are familiar with the old wild type of Rose of Sharon that makes a carpet of seedlings underneath it, so it's a bit of a nuisance in the garden, but decades ago, the National Arboretum bred Rose of Sharons that are sterile, that don't make any seeds, so you don't have all those unwanted seedlings. And I believe there were 5 cultivars they introduced, all named for, I guess, Greek goddesses. This is Helen. There was also Diane, which is pure white, and Aphrodite, which is pink, and Minerva was sort of a blue lavender. But really worthwhile. They'll bloom through the worst of the summertime. And I don't see those 5 cultivars still available, but there are more modern cultivars that, even though in the catalogs they don't describe as being sterile, I think they might be. While we're on the subject of hibiscus, I'll just point out this one. This is one of our native species of hibiscus. This is Hibiscus grandiflorus. It has a big pink flower. I see flower buds on this, so, oh yeah, there's a whole bunch of flower buds. But we grow it probably even more for its leaves. The leaves are very velvety, and it's a lovely gray color, so we do grow it for that. Okay, and right behind it is an interesting shrub with foliage that looks like a juniper. It's Tamarix, salt cedar. Not related at all to junipers, because junipers are not flowering plants. And its peak of bloom is in the spring, but it'll have a smattering of flowers on and off in the summer. It's salt cedar because in its native habitat, it's usually, you know, at the edges of salt marshes, liking moist soil, but not soggy soil. And I don't know if in the screen you've seen some very sad looking salvias. Most of the plants in this border were thrilled when we forgot to turn the sprinkler off, but this salvia, which is always glorious in late fall, being a native of drier parts of the Southwest, is grumbling about being kept wet for so long. But it's starting to perk up. I don't think we've lost it entirely. And maybe some of you have seen this in the screen. This is an intergeneric hybrid. It's one of its parents is a Crinum. The other parent is Amaryllis belladonna. Now, the plants we most often grow as potted houseplants, that we call Amaryllis, are now in a different genus, Hippeastrum, meaning horse star, because of the white center of the flower. Looks like the blaze on a horse's forehead. And Amaryllis belladonna there's now only one species that's considered an Amaryllis. And Amaryllis belladonna looks almost identical to those naked ladies we saw early, the Lycoris squamidra, the big fleshy pink spider lily. Except that Amaryllis belladonna tries to grow through the winter and the foliage gets damaged even in zone 7. So it doesn't persist long for us. But crossed with a Crinum, you end up with an intermediate sized plant that's fully winter hardy. And the Amerocrinums is the genus that these hybrids belong to, combining Amaryllis and Crinum. And they're just starting to bloom, but they'll produce a long succession of scapes into the fall. So really worthwhile. Pink is the typical color. There's a really pretty white one called Born Free, and some that are sort of intermediate in color. Things that like it hot are not limited to just flowering things. Some of the things that add a lot of color to the garden this time of year are colorful foliage plants. And this grass is the giant cane, Arundodonax, which is a species native to southern Europe and around the Mediterranean. Typical form is green. There's a old variegated form that was popular during the Victorian era for their plantings of subtropicals like cannas and bananas. And it was very brightly variegated in the spring, but by this time of year in midsummer would have turned all green. And so this is an improved selection called peppermint. And in spring, what is now sort of pale yellow is a pure white. So at this time of the year, it looks like another variegated cultivar of this one called Golden Chain, which is a lot less vigorous, but is yellow in foliage in the spring. Interesting thing about the giant cane is that the canes are used to make the reeds for wind instruments, like a clarinet or an oboe. In a typical zone 7 winter, it dies to the ground, but the last couple winters have been milder, so canes have overwintered. And when they do, they'll make all these side shoots from last year's stems. I think they look a little raggedy that way, so if the winter doesn't cut them to the ground, I would probably cut them to the ground myself. Right in front of us are far too many seedlings of ironweed. Ironweed is Vernonia. And I am not going to put a species on these because when you grow more than one species of ironweed in a garden, they hybridize and then you'll never be able to put a name on them again. They are probably largely seedlings of this wonderful, really tall ironweed, Vernonia Oh, they just are changing the names. It used to be Gigantea, now I guess it's Altissima. Gigantea, you can figure out what that means. Altissima means very tall. And this is the selection from Plant Delight's nursery called Jonestown Giant, I believe. I like tall plants, big and bold. And the ironweeds are, you can see some butterflies up on those flowers, great for pollinators. Certainly a good plant for a wet site, but absolutely does not need to have a wet site. I'm molesting this tree tobacco here, and I am calling it a tobacco because it is the same genus as tobacco, which is Nicotiana. And this is Nicotiana glauca because of its glaucous blue-gray foliage. And in a mild winter, or actually in most winters here, the stems stay alive over winter. And so it does get, what is that, 10 feet tall, certainly maybe a little bit taller. And it's been in bloom for a good long time. Hummingbirds love these tubular flowers. We're not getting seedlings. It, in recent years, has started spreading underground, so we need to corral it a little bit. And Chris, do you want me to stop soon? Is that why you're showing me the clock? Or?
I am showing you the time, Doug, because it's a little after 4 o'clock, which means we've been touring for a little more than an hour, and my battery is coming to an end. So how about if we take a couple of questions and let everyone go for the afternoon? Anyone have a question? Go ahead and turn your microphone on and ask it, or go ahead and ask it in the chat.
You said that you cut back that golden hibiscus and it reflushes growth and flowers?
Yes.
Would that work for other members of the mallow family, like the marsh mallow or swamp mallow one?
It might. You know, it's worth a try. The wild marshmallow is done blooming fairly early in the summer, so you could try that. Or you could just cut it back far enough that you're cutting all the seed heads off. When plants produce seed, if they've managed to successfully produce seed, then it's like, oh, I don't need to bloom anymore, mission accomplished. So when you remove seeds, often, not all plants, but a lot of plants will then resume blooming again.
I think we might have enough battery left for one more question. Anyone have a question? Well, it's not sounding like it, so thank you so much, Doug, for a great tour again today. We had a great one yesterday as well. And thank you, everyone, for coming out and enjoying an online tour with Doug out here at the J.C. Ralston Arboretum. We'll see you again next week at 3. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.